Is it possible for a Jew to be an atheist?
Is it possible for a Jew to be an atheist? Any Jew who's an atheist will tell you it's not only possible, but it's actual. What does that mean? Is it possible for a Jew to be an atheist? Is it possible for a non-Jew to be an atheist? In other words, is God the matter of faith or is God the matter of reason? If God is a matter of faith, you can say intellectually you don't believe. But if God is a matter of reason, how could there be an atheist? And yet there are atheists. You know, they say that there's no atheist in a foxhole. You know, when people find themselves in very, very difficult situations, they cry out to God. And I'm sure atheists have a resolution to that as well, and an explanation for that as well. What is atheism, right? What is atheism? Atheism says basically there is no theos, there is no God, because there is no proof, right? And this is the old game that's played in the intellectual environs, as it were, where some people say there's a God, it's obvious, and other people say there's no God, there's no proof. So why does one person say it's obvious that there's a God, and it's logical and it's clear, and another person say there's no God, Rahman al-Islam, because there's no proof? The true answer to the question is not intellectual. In other words, why one person decides that his brain tells him that there is a God, another person's brain tells him there is no God, is not based on the brain, it's based on the person. This is basic to what a person is, and it's certainly basic to what a person is, al pi Hasidus. A human being is not his brain, a human being is his soul. And the brain serves the soul. So based on the place where one's soul is, one says, intellectually there is no God, and another one says intellectually there is yes a God. Neither of them are coming strictly from an intellectual level, although each one is trying to argue they come from an intellectual level. Each one is coming from what they are as a person. But I can't argue my soul, and you can't argue your soul, because who am I? So each one uses logic, uses the framework of reason to make his case. So the atheist says, it doesn't make sense that there's a God, there is no proof. But the real reason the atheist is an atheist is because something which is outside of his atheism is making him be an atheist. And of course, the person who believes and argues intellectually that there is a God, the real place for Hashem in that person is not in their mind. The real place for Hashem is in their neshama. It manifests in the mind. In other words, where is there the debate? The debate exists on the level of the form of ideas. In the realm of seichel, the intellectual level, which is all told one of many tools that a person has. The heart is a different tool. The senses are different tools. One of the tools that a person has is intellectual tool. Intellectual tool claims to be able to find truth, and claims to argue that's the only one that could know what's real. And it claims that nobody else is entitled to disagree with whatever it is that the brain says. Within the parameters of the brain, there is a debate. Is there a God and or is there not a God? So first of all, it's only in this arena where this debate exists. And second of all, when the brain says there is a God, or the brain says there isn't a God, it's not really the brain that's making this determination, it's the person. And the person is using his brain to make the case of his neshama, is using to make the case of his subconscious, if you will. But there's another aspect of this, or another way to look at this. There's another point that needs to be made. And that is that when the atheist and the theist, when the one who believes in God, the one who doesn't believe in God, argue, and they argue on an intellectual level, part of the argument is about the premise that I just established. In other words, when a person believes in God, and he argues that you can intellectually argue that there is a God, he does not deny that the beginning of the inspiration for God comes from outside of his mind. He does not deny that the real source of his relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is spiritual, is transcendent, but that it makes sense also. For the atheist, although it is true that the real basis for his atheism isn't his mind, but his ego, or his humanity, whatever that is, part of his atheism is to argue that there is nothing outside of his mind, which is the basis for his atheism. In other words, the fact is that the human mind is a tool, and people use the mind as they wish. So whether a person uses his mind to prove that there is no God, at least to prove that there's no proof that there is a God, or to prove that there is a God, the real source of their argument isn't the brain, it's their soul. But part of the argument is whether there is a soul altogether. In other words, for a person to be an atheist, the atheist has to say that his intellectual thesis, which tells him that there is no God, is not based on anything but his brain. Because if he concedes that his atheism is based on something but his brain, then his brain is not entitled to say that there's no God. Because the brain is limited. And what's beyond the brain he doesn't know. So there is a difference between using your brain to prove that there is no God, or to use your brain to prove that you cannot prove that there is a God, and using your brain to prove that there is a God. What's the difference? If you use your brain to prove that there is a God, you can embrace the idea that there's something outside of the brain. But if you're using your brain to prove the contrary, you cannot embrace the idea that there's anything beyond the brain. Because if you embrace the idea that there's anything beyond the brain, then the brain cannot argue that there's nothing beyond the brain. It's conceding that there's something beyond the brain. Which means that the question that was asked, which is, can a Jew be an atheist? The answer is, a Jew can be an atheist in his brain. Outside of his brain, he cannot be an atheist. The atheist is going to argue there's nothing outside of the brain. That's part of the foundation of being an atheist. But the moment a person acknowledges that there is something bigger to them than their mind, it's impossible for them to be an atheist. On the other hand, the theist, the person who believes in God, who argues that intellectually this makes sense as well, is not precluding anything outside of his mind, because he's saying that his brain is giving intellectual form to something which is bigger than intellect.